So, how much was your mother's inheritance? I was utterly shocked by James' words. After my mother's funeral, without a single word of concern for me, he said this to me, who was feeling down. He must have thought the inheritance was deposited because he saw me looking at the bank book, but that was unthinkable as a human being. It was about $1 million. $1 million? That's all? But well, even after taxes, there should be hundreds of thousands left. Hearing my reluctant answer, James muttered to himself and smirked with an unpleasant smile. What an awful smile. I don't know what he's thinking, but things won't go his way. However, the next day, James quickly put his plan into action. But his shallow idea would end up taking everything from him. He had yet to realize that. My name is Hillary Morgan. I got married through an arranged marriage when I was 20. My husband's name is James. He is a company employee, 5 years older than me, and the eldest son of the Owen family. However, even though he's called the eldest son, his younger brother, Eric, left the house after graduating from university and is estranged. James was treated as an only child and was very much loved by my parents-in-law. Honestly, I didn't want to marry James. However, my mother came from a family that had been running a business for generations. I was in a position called a young lady, so I couldn't go against what my parents decided. And so, I ended up marrying James, but he also couldn't refuse me since his father was in business. We didn't marry because we had feelings for each other. It was a marriage far from happiness. Furthermore, unfortunately, we couldn't have children. Since we married young, it was hard to give up on having children. And I thought we could get out of this situation if we had a child. But, even going to the hospital didn't make it as we wished. Hey, barren woman. Are the chores done? At first, my parents-in-law, who cherished me as a young lady, started calling me a barren woman after a few years. I mean, you should be able to make it happen. If you do what you're supposed to do. It's a waste of money going to the hospital. My father-in-law would also say mean things to me every day. However, James never stood up for me. Next to me, being scolded by my in-laws, he would either read the newspaper or take a nap, snoring. Even when I wanted a change of pace and said I wanted to work, he would say, "You going to work would make people think we're not doing well," and wouldn't let me leave the house. Indeed, at that time, it was common for women to become homemakers after getting married. However, living with just my mother-in-law was honestly hell every day. No one would help me. I couldn't worry my parents and consult them. And I couldn't run away because our marriage was connected to work. But still, I thought I would be rewarded someday and desperately endured every day. However, no matter how many years passed, the situation never got better. 20 years after our marriage. When I turned 40, my father-in-law died in an accident. That incident led to the discovery that his company had been evading taxes. With back taxes and fines depleting our assets, our property was seized. And the company went bankrupt. The large amount of insurance money on my father-in-law was also used for this. Though we kept the house, we had to let go of our comfortable lifestyle. I thought it would be hard for James, who was then 45, to change jobs. But my parents introduced him to a job. Thanks to that, he quickly found a job. But my mother-in-law became like an empty shell and aged rapidly. For a while, she didn't even have the energy to say mean things to me. Which was a relief, but then she had a stroke and required care. With this, I truly lost any luxury to even consider trying for a child anymore. I was already 40. I was somewhat giving up in my heart, but this became the real turning point for letting go. James, as if it were only natural, pushed the care of his mother onto me. And on his days off, he spent them lounging around just like before. James, I wish you'd help with your mother's care sometimes." One day, I gathered my courage and told him this. Even if it were just on his days off, or even if it were just one meal. If he could help, it would mean so much to me. But James frowned upon hearing my words. "Huh? I'm working, you know? Let me rest on my days off." James didn't seem to understand that I essentially don't have what he calls a days off. After his father's company went under, and my parents were worried about me, they finally said, "Come back home." But what would become of his mother if I left now? We have a caretaker come once a week. But I can't imagine having the money to hire one every day for this house. Despite being used and scorned, I couldn't abandon her. It just wasn't in me to do so. Eventually, James started leaving the house early even on his days off. He said he felt the sting of my gaze if he relaxed at home on those days. My wife won't even let me relax at home on my days off. I heard through the grapevine that he started saying this to the neighbors. And he began taking solo trips. The neighbors knew his mother needed care. Knowing this, yet speaking as if he's dumped all the care on me. He probably doesn't have the sense to think about how he's perceived for saying such things. It was pitiful seeing his mother, who adored James, being avoided by him once she became ill. "It's because you're here that James won't come." Sometimes she would say this, but when I replied, "Should I leave, then?" she would immediately fall silent. Continuing this lifestyle for another 20 years, the long caregiving period ended. And my mother-in-law passed away, reuniting with her husband. I was about to reach my 60s. I had no love left for James, but I had come to terms with many things. At this point, leaving didn't seem possible. And I would likely spend the rest of my days in this house. James was diligent only in his work. This was recognized, and even after reaching retirement age, he was requested to continue working as senior staff. It's a fact that this allows me to live as I do. We were never a close couple, but I am grateful for this aspect. Our marriage wasn't good, but James never tried to kick me out. He probably thinks it's too late for that now. He still seems to prefer being out of the house on his days off. So I've come to enjoy my alone time. I've even taken up pottery as a hobby. I've made friends at this age and am spending days that I can finally consider enjoyable for the first time since getting married. But this seems to have annoyed James. "You're out playing while I'm working," he said, and one day, he burned the bag I used for my pottery class in the yard. "What are you doing? Don't get lost in weird hobbies. Just do the housework." My pottery materials and my pouch were still inside the bag. Even pouring water on it was too late, it turned to ashes. I was truly furious. I thought it was too late for change, but I still have a long way to go. The word divorce crossed my mind. But just as I was considering this, another misfortune struck. It was the sudden passing of my parents. My father died suddenly from an illness, and a month after his funeral, my mother also fell ill and passed away, following my father. It was all so sudden that I was engulfed in sorrow. My brother, Daniel, had already taken over my father's company. And with the many mourners at both my father's and then my mother's funerals, combined with the busyness, I ended up bedridden for about a week afterward. It must have been mental fatigue. My friends from the pottery class were considerate enough to contact me. But James alone mocked me, saying, "How long are you going to sleep?" I was shocked and tired after Mom's funeral too, but I didn't sleep that much. It must be nice being able to sleep all you want without working. It might be a valid point, but as words from a husband to a wife, it scores 0. From the next day, I forced my heavy body to get up and resumed my usual daily routine. Since I still didn't have the luxury to enjoy my hobbies, it was a bare minimum life. But James seemed satisfied, unconcerned about my feelings. Then, after some time had passed since my mother's funeral, I remembered that the payment deadline to the funeral home was approaching, and was looking at the bank book. Daniel was busy with work, so I had promised to make the payment on his behalf. However, James, unaware of this, saw me with the bank book and approached me with a sleazy smile. "So, how much was your mother's inheritance?" I was taken aback by his words. He said this right after my mother's funeral, without a single word of concern for me. He must have thought the inheritance had been deposited because he saw me looking at the bank book, but surely, that's unthinkable for a human being. I answered listlessly. "About $1 million. $1 million? That's it? But, well, even after taxes, there should be hundreds of thousands left." James muttered to himself and smirked with an unpleasant smile. What an awful smile. I don't know what he's thinking, but things won't go his way. Without saying anything to James, I quietly put away the bank book. Seemingly reading the room for once, James finally spoke. "Well, you've had it tough. You should rest early today." James, perhaps out of awkwardness, unusually offered kind words. Far from being happy about it, it made me feel sick. Not because James said so, but I didn't want to see his face anymore and went to bed early that day. However, an incident occurred the next day. As usual, after breakfast, James left for work. But then I received a call saying James hadn't shown up at his workplace. I was shocked. This had never happened before. Worried that he might have been in an accident, I hurriedly called James. But there was no sign of connection. As I paced around restlessly, stepping into the living room, I understood everything. On the living room table lay a piece of paper. It was a divorce form, already filled out by James. The moment I saw it, I thought, no way. And checked where I had put away the bank book the day before. As expected, the bank book was gone. Unbelievable. I muttered and sighed. It wasn't an accident or incident. James had likely disappeared on his own. I had thought he was fussing about something in the living room since the morning. James, having stolen those items, must be planning to start a new life by abandoning me. His not driving me out until now was not because he thought it was too late, but because he was eyeing my parents' inheritance. The stolen bank book was proof enough. Even with this realization, I remained calm. Or rather, there was no need to panic. I slowly filled out the divorce form and took it to the city office. James had sown the seeds of his own doing. I decided to make him fully realize that it was too late for regrets. I properly contacted James's workplace. I can't reach him either, but it doesn't seem like an accident. I'll let you know as soon as I get in touch. Sorry for the inconvenience. I apologized. The workplace said they would treat it as a paid leave for the day and wished him well, making me envious of James for being blessed with such a good workplace. After all, it was a company introduced by my parents. I hoped he would be sincere towards his workplace, but he was going to be a stranger to me now. After that, I successfully submitted the divorce form. After enduring so much, it's surprising how easily I became free. I wonder if there could have been a different life for me if I had divorced earlier. It was when I was packing up things to take with me. My phone rang. It was James, who hadn't answered my calls. I knew what he would say. I ignored it and continued packing. Yet, the phone kept ringing, again and again. Eventually, even the house phone started ringing. It was probably James, but since it was so annoying, I reluctantly decided to answer it. Hello? As I casually said that, sure enough, I heard James' panicked voice from the other end. Yes. I called because I was informed you hadn't shown up for work. You should contact your workplace immediately. That's not the issue right now. James wouldn't really listen to my words. Interrupting me in a panic, he shouted, "I can't withdraw the money." Hearing his voice, I couldn't help but burst out laughing. So he finally noticed, huh? I couldn't help but think. He must not have realized it because he stole them in a hurry. I suppose so. My ID, you burned it, remember? What? No? Don't you remember? It was in the bag for my pottery class. I answered with a laugh. James seemed to be flustered. Then, this ID is. Isn't the ID expired? I wouldn't know. After his mother passed away, I repeatedly asked James to take care of the paperwork. I went to the bank for the procedure, but they said it couldn't be done because I wasn't the heir. Thus, the bank book was left untouched with just a few $10 remaining. Don't mess around. You have to properly organize things for someone who's not here anymore, right? You said you'd take care of it eventually, so keep it in. Don't blame me. Then, what am I supposed to do with this bank book? What to do or not, unless I go to do the paperwork. There's nothing that can be done about it. In my words, James kept complaining. However, I didn't feel like replying and fell silent. Impatient, James seemed to have gone back to the bank teller, explaining the situation. I accidentally burned the ID. Can't anything be done, maybe by proxy? Look, I'm on the phone with my wife right now. It seemed he put it on speaker, and I could hear the troubled voice of the teller too. I questioned his words. James. What are you talking about? You know you can't do anything like that as a stranger, right? Huh? The divorce papers were properly processed just now. Thanks for the preparation.
Bye.
I said what I wanted to say and hung up the phone. Surely, the teller must have heard my last words too. By now, James must be either pale or red with anger. Just imagining it made me laugh. Now, to leave the house before he returns. With that thought, I hurriedly packed my things. And then I left the house. My destination was the empty family home, left vacant after my parents passed away. In fact, I had inherited that family home too. My mother's assets from running a company amounted to $13 million. However, inheriting a large sum of cash would not end well if James heard of it. Especially since we had no children. Therefore, I inherited just enough to not struggle, about $1 million. And the rest was the family home and my mother's beautifully preserved dresses. My father's antiques. These heirlooms, if appraised, would amount to a considerable sum. Of course, I had my brother Daniel's permission. Daniel had moved out after getting married. Worried about the family home becoming vacant. He had children and had taken over the company. He said he was rather grateful to be able to inherit just the cash. Thus, we had peacefully completed the inheritance discussions. After arriving at the family home, I informed Daniel that I had divorced James and would be living in the family home. If you are going to live in the family home, it won't become vacant, which is a relief. But are you really going through with the divorce from James? Are you really okay with this, Hillary? Yes. We don't have children, and both our parents have passed away. If both of us want a divorce, then I think it's for the best. I want to restart my life, and I have no regrets. Daniel was worried about me being alone, but living as James' servant for life would be worse. Besides, if I could spend the last moments of my life in this house, where I spent time with my family, even alone, it would be happiness. James kept calling me many times after that. However, seemingly confused, he didn't think I would be at the family home and never came to visit. That day, I spent it alone, peacefully. The house was indeed lonely without a family, but I felt relieved from the bottom of my heart. The next day, I finally mustered up the energy to go make a deposit. The bank book was with James. It was a bit bothersome to retrieve it, but I went to get it around 6 a.m., assuming James would be asleep. Returning home, just opening the front door, the smell of alcohol hit me. Wow. I couldn't help but grimace at the smell. Entering the living room, beer cans were scattered messily. Additionally, my bankbook was torn and left on the table. This is terrible. To tear up someone's bankbook like this, no matter how angry one was. I gathered it up and put it in my bag. Along with that, I took a few clothes and returned home once again. Then, I headed to the bank. As I approached the entrance, I was called out. Hillary. James. Surprisingly, James was lying in wait for me. I noticed the bankbook was gone, so I figured you'd come here. Whether I come here or not, it's none of your business. Don't say that. We've been together for so long. Even though the divorce had been finalized, he still said such things. I ignored him and entered the bank. James continued trying to cheer me up next to me. However, I firmly ignored him. That's when it happened. Brother, isn't that Hillary? Someone called out to us. Eric, why are you here? It was James' brother, Eric. Both James and I were surprised by this unexpected encounter. We hardly saw Eric, only at funerals, almost estranged. It had been about 40 years since I married James, and this was probably only the third time we met. He had wanted to cut ties, but the in-laws, fearing the company's reputation would be damaged if it was known their son had estranged them, pleaded with him to at least show up for important family events. Since we had met at the mother-in-law's funeral a few years ago, he probably recognized us. I'm here for the inheritance of Mom's estate. Thought I'd check the balance and then inform you too. Mom's? James's eyes lit up. I was surprised too. I thought it was just a few $10 left in the bankbook, but according to Eric, there were also investment trusts set up a long time ago. And safety deposit boxes borrowed during the father-in-law's lifetime. Eric had heard about it from his mother before she passed away. She had sent him a message before her demise, saying, "If anything happens, you take care of it." However, due to his busy life, it had taken him this long to act. But, well, Eric looked apologetically at Hillary and James. What is it?
Yeah.
There was a letter in the safety deposit box along with the jewelry. Mom said all her estate should go to Hillary. What? I was surprised by Eric's words, but James seemed even more shocked. Eric pulled out a letter from the documents he had compiled. I recognized the stationery. It was because I had bought it at the request of my mother-in-law. It clearly stated all the jewelry in the safety deposit box and other assets should go to my daughter-in-law, Hillary. I could picture my mother-in-law painstakingly writing it. Shall I bring out the letter? I had asked, only to be coldly told. It has nothing to do with you. Perhaps she meant to write this at that time. I involuntarily covered my mouth. Hillary, you've been taking care of the caregiving all by yourself, right? Despite the mean things, she wrote she was sorry. She said to let me handle it because if she told James, he'd probably hush it up. Next to me, James's face turned beet red, and he began to tremble. Well, I never intended to inherit anyway, but as the legal heir, I thought I had to take care of it. It's just a change of name to Hillary. So that shouldn't be a problem for you, right, James? Eric said this nonchalantly, unaware of our divorce. Later, I was called to the bank counter. James seemed to lack the energy to follow. Without any real business, he just sat in the lobby. That day, I completed the reissuance of the bankbook, the transfer to the funeral home. Then, I'll be going ahead. Hillary, I'll contact you again. Leaving Eric and a dazed James behind, I safely returned home. Eric contacted me again later. James had protested, "Such a letter is invalid." But Eric persuaded him, saying, "Respect Mom's wishes." However, unable to convince an unsatisfied James, Eric visited a lawyer for a free consultation. Though the letter couldn't be recognized as an official will, the lawyer advised that settling by discussion would be more cost-effective than hiring a lawyer. And James agreed to the inheritance of the house. The investment trusts weren't worth much, and James grudgingly gave up on those and the jewelry. Thus, I formally received my mother-in-law's estate. If Hillary gets Mom's estate, I should get it from my mother-in-law, right? James challenged the lawyer, but that was a different matter. It was embarrassing. Even scolded by the lawyer, James couldn't accept it and finally tracked me down at the family home, showing up at our doorstep. I was wrong. Let's start over. Realizing he couldn't receive anything and kneeling at the doorstep, he begged for reconciliation. Start over? There was never any love between us to begin with. What's there to start over? For the first time, I conveyed my long-held feelings to James. He fell silent, seemingly regretting his actions for the first time, and I couldn't help but smile. At least you kept the house, right? Oh, have you contacted your workplace? If you're so desperate for money, better work hard. Don't lose your job. After saying just that, I closed the door. It was finally over. The bank book held assets left by our mothers. With this, I would surely live comfortably from now on. James, however, continued to be absent from work without notifying his workplace, leading to his dismissal. I had warned him. Losing even his passion for work, what was left for him? Perhaps his diligent work was not out of responsibility, but to maintain his dignity. Now without anyone to show his dignity to and missing the easy money he thought he'd get, it wouldn't be surprising if he felt he had lost his purpose in life. Despite being concerned for someone I had spent years with, that was it. I had no intention of helping him. I truly apologize for the trouble caused to you, Hillary. It's really regrettable. Eric was the only one who apologized for everything, and told me I no longer needed to deal with James. Realizing the family's abnormality, early on, Eric had left home young, probably living happily now without involving his family in that home. James had become a recluse, but at his age, he could probably live on his pension. Wanting to start over showed he had the courage, at least. He should try starting over on his own. I began attending pottery classes again. My friends were delighted with my return, and I hadn't realized how enjoyable it could be to spend time just for myself. At the pottery class, I even met someone wonderful, though I swore off marriage. Being with someone who loves me might also be a form of happiness rather than being alone forever. It might feel too late, but just like with the divorce, it's never too late as long as you're alive. Anyone can find happiness, no matter their age. I believe that. In the completely dark mountains, I was pulled by the arm and roughly dropped out of the car. I don't need a gold digger like you coming back. Sleeping outdoors sounds fun. From inside the car, my husband and mother-in-law just opened the window and, laughing together, said that. Then, the car quickly drove away. If only I could fly away into the sky. Today, as always, I was looking outside through the window. I am 30 years old. I am married to Ken, who is 32. And we live together with my mother-in-law, Martha. My parents, actually, died in an accident, leaving me with no relatives. I worked as an office lady and married, but after moving in together, I suddenly developed asthma. The condition was severe, and I became disabled and couldn't work anymore. I said I liked quiet women, but I never said I liked women with quiet health conditions. My husband came home and said this in an irritated tone. His attitude was harsher than usual. That's when I understood. Today is, the 25th. Payday. Normally, with both of us working, we should be able to live a richer life than most. How did it come to this? Thinking about how much of our salary goes to utilities, how much is taken by taxes. My husband was particularly moody on payday. A continuous clicking of his tongue. But what can I do? And while grumbling his dissatisfaction, he lit a cigarette, took a deep drag, and then exhaled the accumulated smoke. Cough. Cough. I choked on the smoke from the Marlboro cigarette. Even the smoke lingering in the room was too much for me. I felt like a piece of smoked ham. Then, Martha also lit her own Winston cigarette, which had been lying on the table. She too inhaled deeply, then exhaled the smoke just like before. Why does she have to imitate even this? I coughed again. Since my husband and mother-in-law smoke different brands, it felt like I was being smoked with a mix of cherry and applewood chips. I can relate to you now, ham. Watching me cough, both of them looked even more annoyed. This had become a monthly payday ritual. Really. I wish you'd earn at least enough to cover our cigarette expenses. So dramatic. You're coughing from asthma anyway, aren't you? That constant coughing and wheezing is so annoying. A good-for-nothing fox. My mother-in-law took another drag and exhaled a cloud of white smoke. The monthly payday event. A mother and son's joint bride bullying festival. Being criticized for my inability to work and my illness while engulfed in smoke was nothing but torture for me. But when you think about it, we should have questioned this from the start. Is asthma really so debilitating that you can't work? It's just a cough, right? One evening, my mother-in-law started this conversation. Apparently out of cigarettes, she pulled out her wallet to buy more, only to realize she didn't have enough money for them. Her irritation at this discovery triggered the rant. Asthma and a mere cough are completely different. But my mother-in-law continued. Even when you were hospitalized last year, I thought it was just the doctor wanting to make money, fooling you. I mean, hospitalized just for a cough? When I asked around, everyone said it sounded ridiculous. Indeed, it was true that I couldn't work anymore, and the income one might have earned was lost. I'm not one to talk back against such harsh words, so I could only listen to my mother-in-law's unreasonable tirade. But then Ken added fuel to the fire. That's really true. Ken agreed. Just for a cough, you get a mountain of medicines. And it's not just once, it keeps going on. Why should we get involved in your time killing and the doctor's money making? He too fumbled in his chest pocket, seemingly wanting a cigarette. Though Ken still had a few cigarettes. He seemed to get irritated discussing this while being a few short. He kept clicking his tongue. Exactly. My mother-in-law, as if struck by a sudden idea, reached for my bag. She roughly grabbed my everyday shoulder bag and unzipped it. Then, holding it with both hands, she turned it upside down towards the ceiling and opened the mouth of the bag wide, shaking it out. Everything inside my bag tumbled out, scattering in various directions on the floor. From the scattered pile, Martha reached straight for my wallet. What? I felt exposed, as if my privacy had been violated, and was shocked by her brazen touch on my wallet. Is she going to take the money for cigarettes? But Martha's next action surpassed all my expectations. It's crazy to go to the hospital just for a cough. We need to correct this wasteful behavior of the fallen bride. Martha shouted, and from my wallet, she pulled out, not cash or coins, but my Medicare card. I was utterly shocked, as the item she extracted was far beyond what I had imagined. The unexpected sight of my Medicare card left me speechless. Ignoring my stunned and frozen state, Martha proceeded with her next action. Holding my insurance card, She headed straight to the drawer where my medications were stored, opened it, and grabbed a month's worth of my medication. Returning to the living room, she began yelling at me. "Just for a cough, you're buying all these medicines. This is excessive luxury. It's because of these ineffective medicines that you're not getting better. For a cough, you just need throat lozenges, plenty of which are available at any supermarket." After her tirade, she threw my medications and the Medicare card into the trash can with the organic waste. My lifeline. I turned pale. Well, they say the beginning is the hardest part of quitting smoking. You can do it. It's quitting medicines in your case, though. My husband grinned slyly. They say quitting smoking starts with candy. Everything begins with candy, after all. I was now receiving guidance from these two people who never could quit smoking, for some reason. Mother's tough love is different, indeed. Oh, and while you're at it, hand over some money for cigarettes from that wallet. All right, I'll take some too. $20 was taken from my wallet, which was then carelessly tossed back onto the floor among the scattered contents of my bag. As I sat down to put everything back into my bag, I watched my mother-in-law and husband praise each other for discarding my medication and taking cigarette money from my wallet. The thought of possibly having an asthma attack tomorrow without my medicine left me feeling breathless with anxiety, and thought, I want to fly away. I want to escape from this place. But it seems that just throwing away my medication and banning me from hospital visits wasn't enough for Martha and Ken. "Just because we're married doesn't mean I have to support someone who can't work," said Ken. "If you couldn't work and had your own family, you'd have been divorced quickly. Like in the old drama. When a factory girl couldn't work anymore, she was sent back to her hometown," added Martha. "The only reason you're here is that you have nowhere else to go to shelter from the rain and wind," they began. "That's not true. I'm not just sitting here doing nothing. I take care of all the household chores." I felt compelled to speak up, even though I'm usually timid. Indeed, I was the one who prepared lunch and dinner boxes for Ken. And I did all the cleaning and laundry. Martha never helped with household chores. But their response was dismissive. "What are you saying? Household chores aren't real work. If you were earning a wage, we could hire a maid with change to spare. A wife who just loafs around the house without even having kids," they said. And the parent-child meeting continued, eventually concluding that I should be grateful just for being given shelter. How can we make her understand her place? Maybe we should just leave her in the mountains. Or on an island. Or maybe bury her underground. This conversation about abandoning me became more serious. And I broke out in a cold sweat. It was no longer a joke. My worst fears were confirmed. My husband and mother-in-law were actually planning to abandon me. Maybe it's time for you to understand your place, to experience it firsthand. They say experience is the best teacher, after all. That's a good idea. They talked about leaving me in the mountains as if it were a school field trip, to make me appreciate being allowed to stay at home. I couldn't let that happen. I desperately resisted. "Wait, I really can't survive if you leave me. I have asthma. I really do appreciate being allowed to stay at home. That's why I do so much housework." But my pleas were ignored. "If you were really grateful, you wouldn't be coughing and making noise all the time," they said. "Seeing the night view will make you appreciate the happiness of home more. And think about how you'll treat me in my old age, overnight," they said heartlessly. And so, I was forcibly pushed into the car by Ken. Of course, at this point, my smartphone was taken away. After a 3-hour drive, in the darkness, I was pulled out of the car and abandoned in an unknown mountain area. Ken slammed the car door as he got back into the driver's seat. I ran and clung to the car, but Ken just honked the horn as if to say, "Don't come near. We don't need a leech like you coming back. Sleeping outdoors sounds fun." From inside the car, my husband and mother-in-law only opened the window to say these words. "Wait, really, just wait." I cried out, almost in tears, but my voice was ignored. With a loud vroom, the window was closed, and then the car quickly drove away. I watched the last light of the car's tail lights until they disappeared, filled with a sense of helplessness. Only when the lights were no longer visible did I look around. There was no night view to see. There was not a single light. I want to fly away. I looked up at the sky. In the pitch darkness, the stars seemed exceptionally beautiful. Without any lights, the sky seemed so close and clear. I opened the zipper of the backpack that had been thrown out with me. As I took out its contents, I took a deep breath. Having my smartphone taken away and being abandoned in the mountains. Did they really think I would kneel down, shed tears, and say, "Thank you for just letting me stay in your house, I'll eat grass to survive. Please forgive me, dear husband and mother-in-law. I'll burn down such a blueprint they had in mind. I'll fly away." Several days later, I was facing my husband and mother-in-law. But not at home. I was in a guest house. A bright room in the guest house. The new, clean floors reflected the sunlight, making the room look even brighter. Such a stark contrast to that dark night. I saw it on TV. Despite the reflected light, he had a terribly pale face, beyond blue to almost black. And he started speaking in a trembling voice, looking down. Opposite to him, I was in a cheerful mood. Just like the weather today. Yes. It was good news, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It was. I'll show it to you again. The landlady of the guest house had kindly recorded it, and I deliberately played it on the TV. The morning news. Rescued by a drone calling for help. It was featured as a piece of bright news. In the video, I was being interviewed. "Your drone piloting skills were amazing." Yes, I've been into aerial photography as a hobby for a long time. So flying at night wasn't a problem. The reporter asked more questions. "When did you come up with the idea to attach a letter to the drone?" I responded with a smile. I had been planning it since my husband and mother-in-law started talking about wanting to abandon me in the mountains. While showing them the interview, I looked down at the two of them, cowering. How does it feel to have your actions exposed to the whole country? Ken and Martha were trembling, their lips quivering. When did you learn to operate a drone?" he asked in a feeble voice. I chuckled. "Since you started calling me a waste of space. That's when I started thinking about flying away. My desire to fly away grew stronger after my health deteriorated. And I was subjected to their verbal abuse. I would often look up at the sky, sighing. But one day, while I was doing chores, I happened to see a TV program about drones. It gave me hope. I secretly learned how to operate a drone using the money I had saved when I was single. I didn't tell my husband and mother-in-law because I feared they would criticize it as another expensive hobby. You two, who even took away my Medicare card, wouldn't think I'd share my interest in drones with you. I could easily imagine you taking it away and destroying it. When I thought they might abandon me, I sneaked a foldable drone into my backpack. I attached a letter requesting rescue and sent it flying. The person who found it was the landlady of this guest house. Thus, I was rescued, and the TV picked up my story. The drone rescue request became a topic of interest. People saw me on the news and learned about what my husband and mother-in-law had been doing to me. They turned pale and came here to face me. "Well, it's good that you came here willingly," I said nonchalantly. finally finding some semblance of control and empowerment in this difficult situation. Indeed, behind Ken and mother-in-law Martha, two shadows had been looming the whole time. That was why they were so pale. I never thought it would become such a big deal. Ken exclaimed. It's just a cough, after all. Martha cried. I thought sleeping outdoors would be enjoyable to some extent. I couldn't help but laugh at their completely inadequate excuses. Without consent? Dragging me into a car? And then dragging me out of it by force? Ken stammered, that was. As he struggled to speak, I gave a nod to the police officers. The officers approached them. Their already shrunken figures seemed to shrink even more under the pressure. Would you please accompany us to the station? What? They both started gasping like fish out of water when told this. Surprised? Can't breathe? I laughed, watching them. I couldn't breathe properly for a long time because of my asthma. With the police present, it was clear they understood the gravity of their actions. What you did isn't just a prank. It's serious misconduct. And by the way, throwing away my medication is also destruction of property. But I wasn't finished yet. And one last thing, about all the things you've been saying to me. I caressed my drone. You probably know by now, since the news and various media outlets have covered it. Thanks to them, my name is out there, and I've gotten sponsors. Of course, all the aerial photography I did, fueled by my desire to fly away and seek salvation from above, has been recognized. From now on, I'll live as an aerial drone photographer. What? They were even more shocked, but they couldn't fall back. Two police officers stood behind them. Ken, almost breathless, asked, "Does that mean you're making money now?" I answered his question. Yes, at least 3 times your monthly salary. That's when Martha tried to appeal to me. I'm sorry, Anne. Let's live together peacefully from now on. That's the first time you've called me by my name. Until now, it was always, hey, you. I smiled for the first time today. I'm really sorry. I'll call you by your name from now on. I firmly rejected her offer. I refuse to live with you. Cigarette smoke is bad for asthma. Ken, in a panic, took out his pack of cigarettes, crushed it, and placed the crumpled pack on the table between us as a sign of his commitment. I won't smoke anymore, so, please, no arrest, and let's live together and support each other. You're joking, right? I took the pack of cigarettes and put it back in his chest pocket. Why don't you both continue to blow smoke in each other's faces? Watching the crushed and unsmokable cigarettes in his hand, Ken let out a distorted groan. And so, he and Martha were taken away by the police. I sought a substantial amount in damages for their harassment and successfully divorced Ken. Thanks to the news coverage, I became a drone photographer, using drones for aerial photography. Drones can be used for photography anywhere. So I continued to live in this countryside, which I became acquainted with after descending from the mountain. Having cut ties with my cigarette-smoking husband and mother-in-law, my asthma improved a bit. Of course, my medication was no longer being thrown away, and my treatment proceeded smoothly. Connections made through aerial photography led to new opportunities. And now I also participate in test flights for drone development projects. I was able to fly in the sky. I will continue to fly in the sky. I gripped the control sticks of my drone's remote, ready to soar once again. Don't make terrible food when relatives are gathered. Paul, just after taking a bite of the meal, overturned his plate on the table, letting out a shout that echoed throughout the room. The gathered relatives all looked at him in shock. Having never seen someone throw food on the floor like that, they must all feel the same way. Hey, what are you doing? it's your fault for making such bad food. You're a stay-at-home wife, and yet you make such careless meals at times like this. Who could eat this? Paul snorted with laughter. I looked at him with pity and said, I didn't make it, you know? What? He froze, making a foolish noise. Now is the moment. The perfect chance for me, who has been oppressed, to fight back. I took a deep breath to compose myself. My name is Courtney Reed, 32 years old. Until a year ago, I worked for a condominium management company. But I quit when I got married, so now I am a stay-at-home wife. If it weren't for Paul's strong urging, I would have continued working at the company. However, Paul wanted me to be a stay-at-home wife by all means. I acquiesced to his request and left the company. Truth be told, I wanted to work a bit longer, but considering Paul's income, I thought we could live comfortably without me working. Paul works for a major consulting firm. We met through work, and as we were both in charge of the same project, we became romantically involved and eventually got married. Paul was adept at his job and had a way with words. Having worked at various consulting firms right after graduating from college, I was impressed by his work ethic and made the first move. I never thought someone like him would reciprocate my feelings, but he did, to my surprise. I was so happy that I bragged about him to all my friends. They seemed fed up, but I truly believed this was the peak of my happiness. When we decided to get married after a little over a year of dating, I was completely over the moon, unaware of the calamities that awaited me. Look, I'm busy with work on weekdays, so I'll only come home on weekends. Hope that's okay with you. On the night we submitted our marriage registration at the city hall, Paul casually mentioned this while watching TV in the living room. I was stunned by his unexpected statement, thinking our happy married life was about to begin. Huh? What do you mean? I mean, I'll come back only on weekends. It keeps the feeling of when we were dating alive, right? Huh, but... What, you have a problem with that? No, not at all. Honestly, I was taken aback by his sudden proposition. Coming home only on weekends, isn't that what's called a weekend marriage? It's strange to decide such an important matter by oneself without discussion. It would have been better if he had mentioned wanting a weekend marriage before we got married, rather than declaring it suddenly on the day we registered our marriage. Sure, seeing each other less might keep the excitement alive. But isn't it natural to want to be with the one you love all the time? My excitement for our new married life was dampened more than I expected. Perhaps out of pity for me or in an attempt to improve his mood. I couldn't tell, but that day Paul was unusually kind to me. The night brought our first conjugal life, and temporarily, the idea of a weekend marriage was pushed out of my mind. Maybe it was Paul's winning strategy. In hindsight, Paul's declaration at that time was just the prologue. I hadn't even imagined the harder times that were to come. Far beyond the surprise of a weekend marriage. 2 months into our marriage, as Paul had declared beforehand, he only came home on weekends. As a stay-at-home wife, I had hoped to serve dinner to my husband. Tired from his daily work, but my enthusiasm quickly deflated. Even when he came home on weekends, there were times he would eat out instead. So, he hardly ever ate what I prepared. I had been subtly suggesting, can't we stop this weekend's marriage? But Paul would overpower my opinion, saying, huh? For a stay-at-home wife, you sure dare to go against what I say, huh? Indeed, I was a stay-at-home wife, but that was because Paul wanted it so. I now understood that Paul had made me quit my job, so that he could have his way in our household life. He maneuvered to make me financially dependent on him, making it impossible for me to go against his orders. That must have been Paul's aim. At night, tears of frustration would flow. How did things end up like this? I just wanted a happy married life. It's too late to lament now. I have no choice but to wait patiently until Paul changes his mind. I felt as if I was thrown into a tunnel without an exit, filled with anxiety. As we entered the 3rd month of marriage, Paul started to come home only occasionally, even on weekends. This wasn't what was promised. With hardly any face-to-face time as a couple, what's the point of being married? Can we talk about our life together again? I gathered my courage to ask him again on a Friday night. Paul smelled of alcohol, possibly from drinking at his company. At the same time, a sweet scent, like that of osmanthus, wafted through. I was taken aback. Could it be? I've told you countless times. I have no intention of changing now. Even drunk, Paul was determined to stick to his stance. But this is different from what we initially agreed upon. You said we'd spend the weekends together. What about now? You don't even come home on weekends. I never agreed to this. Seeing my point made Paul's face turn red with anger. I realized I had made him upset. How many times do I have to say it? I will not budge. Seriously, why do you always have to complain? Why don't you understand your place? Paul's attitude towards me, so different from before we got married, made me feel not just angry but deeply sad. Why did Paul even marry me? Unable to bear it any longer, I retreated to my room. When I heard Paul getting into the bath, I sneaked into his room. I didn't want to do this, but I couldn't stand being at a disadvantage anymore. Desperately, I searched his room for certain evidence. Months went by with Paul and I practically living separately. I stopped saying anything to Paul, who hardly ever came home. There was something else on my mind, so I decided to live quietly for now. Then one day, I received a call on my mobile phone. It was my mother-in-law. I hadn't seen my mother-in-law since we met for marriage introductions. Wondering what she wanted, I picked up the phone. Hello? Courtney? It's me. Hello, Mother. What's the matter? It sounded like my mother-in-law was at a supermarket, with noisy voices coming through the phone. You know, Christmas is coming up. You'll be coming to our house for it, right? All the relatives will be gathering, and we'd like you to come too. Oh, about Christmas? Yes, I'd love to come. More importantly, Mother. I decided to probe because I thought my mother-in-law might know something about Paul. Have you spoken to Paul recently? Paul? Yes, I've talked to him several times. He's finally married, so I've been checking in on him, and he says married life is going well. What? I was puzzled by what my mother-in-law said. Married life is going well? Was that what Paul told his mother? How could this weekend marriage be considered going well? Then, it hit me. Paul was deliberately lying to his mother, claiming our marriage was smooth sailing. My mother-in-law is the worrying type, to put it nicely. She's caring, but to put it bluntly, she's overprotective. I've only met her once. But it was clear from our first meeting conversation how much she dotes on her son. Excuse me for saying this, but I think everything Paul told you might be a lie. Actually, I told my mother-in-law about how Paul had declared from the beginning of our marriage that he would only come home on weekends, and recently, there have been more days when we don't even see each other properly on weekends. What are you talking about, Courtney? Paul would never do such a thing. Are you trying to deceive me by lying? Who do you think you are? My mother-in-law was visibly angry over the phone, raising her voice. I sighed, thinking, as expected. She only believes Paul's words. She doesn't doubt that Paul's words could be lies. If anyone speaks ill of Paul, even if it's his wife, she'll thoroughly condemn them. That's her way. I'm not lying. If you're concerned, I can show you a month's worth of video from inside the house. Angered by being made out to be the villain despite suffering because of Paul, I told my mother-in-law that, but she replied, "I don't need you to do such a shameful thing. You're the worst daughter-in-law," and hung up without believing me. I had a hunch it would come to this. I don't know what my father-in-law thinks of me since he's a man of few words. But my mother-in-law probably sees me as nothing more than a convenient marriage partner for Paul. Knowing this, I felt tired of continuing married life with Paul as it was, and decided to put into action a plan I had been considering for a while. The day of action would be the Christmas gathering at Paul's family home. I wasn't sure what would happen, but I was determined to do everything I could. I silently steeled myself for the upcoming battle. As promised, I headed to Paul's parents' house for Christmas. Before leaving home, I contacted a certain person. Paul, oblivious to everything, grumbled about having to go to his parents' house and reluctantly prepared to leave. Upon arriving at Paul's parents' house, we were greeted by Paul's parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and a woman who seemed to be a housekeeper, preparing food in the kitchen. The housekeeper, wearing glasses and a mask, naturally didn't join our conversation and just focused on her tasks. With so many people around, it was hard to keep track of everyone. "Welcome, Courtney." Despite her welcoming words, her eyes didn't smile. Probably because she had lost trust in me after our last phone call. I forced a smile and said, "Happy Christmas." After that, there was no further conversation with my mother-in-law, and we proceeded with meal preparation. I also helped in the kitchen. My father-in-law, as always, remained silent, sitting on the sofa reading the newspaper. Once the meal was ready and I had finished serving, everyone began to eat. I saw Paul picking up a plate of stew from the corner of my eye. Just as I reached for the rice, feeling hungry, Paul exclaimed, "Making such terrible food when relatives are gathered." A dull sound of ceramic hitting the floor made everyone's shoulders jump. Paul, just after taking a bite of the meal, overturned his plate on the table, letting out a shout that echoed throughout the room. The gathered relatives all looked at Paul in shock. They had never seen someone throw food on the floor before. Surely, they all felt the same way. "Hey, what are you doing? It's your fault for making such bad food. You're a stay-at-home wife, and yet you make such careless meals at times like this. Who could eat this?" Paul snorted with laughter. I looked at him with pity and said, "I didn't make it, you know." "What?" He froze, making a foolish noise. Now is the moment. The perfect chance for me, who has been oppressed, to fight back. I took a deep breath to compose myself. "What are you talking about? You were in the kitchen preparing the meal just a moment ago." Paul laughed through his nose, looking at me with a face that said, "This makes no sense." "Sure, I was there. But the housekeeper was there too, right? I was only preparing the dishes. The housekeeper made the food. Right?" I looked towards the housekeeper, who was supposed to be resting in the back room but had somehow appeared. The relatives were all surprised to see the housekeeper. "Yes, that's correct. See. By the way, this housekeeper, I invited her. Let me introduce her. She's my mother." The housekeeper, no, my mother, took off her glasses and mask. Seeing her face, Paul and his parents were shocked. They knew my mother's face, so they were surprised to see her there. Weren't you the housekeeper Paul hired?" "I don't know anything about that. I wouldn't arrange something like that." It seemed my mother-in-law had thought Paul arranged for the housekeeper. Trembling all over. "Hey, Paul. You know what my mother does for a living, right? She works at a traditional inn and makes delicious meals every day. But today, she made the food with less seasoning for a home-style meal. Why did you think I made the food? Because you were in the kitchen until just now." Paul raised his voice, irritated by my question. Objectively, it might seem natural to think I helped. My mother prepared the meal since I was in the kitchen. But what Paul doesn't know, since he hardly eats my cooking, is that my cooking is not lightly seasoned like the food my mother made today. I prefer stronger flavors, so I use plenty of sauce and seasoning. That's true. But the main reason is that you've hardly ever eaten my cooking. Huh? What do you mean? Everyone else present, confused and wide-eyed, watched as Paul's face turned pale. I decided it was time to expose all of his dishonesty right then and there. Paul declared on the day we registered our marriage that he would not come home on weekdays and we would only spend weekends together. Essentially a weekend marriage. He never mentioned such a thing before we got married. I was shocked. I couldn't agree with it, but whenever I tried to oppose or discuss it, he would stubbornly say, "A stay-at-home wife like you shouldn't oppose me." And he wouldn't listen to my opinion. The truth about our married life being revealed one after another left the relatives shocked. Especially my mother-in-law, who barked as if to say, "Not that lie again. That's impossible. You're still saying that? I've always received reports from Paul that you two are living happily together. Don't say such embarrassing things in front of the relatives." Seeing my mother-in-law taking Paul's side and looking furious on his behalf, I sighed. It's about time. Maybe it's time to reveal that. Just as I was making up my mind and clenching my fists. "Paul? Are you there?" The voice of an unknown woman came from the entrance, causing all the relatives to twitch their shoulders in shock. As one of the relatives exclaimed, "What's that?" the living room door opened, and a woman peeked in. She was about 20 years old, wearing a short skirt, with bright red nails and glossy hair. The woman looked around at the many people in the living room, then widened her eyes and let out a dumbfounded, "Huh? Paul? What's this about?" The woman, calling for Paul with a flirtatious voice, looked around bewildered, as if asking what was going on. Everyone except me seemed unable to grasp the situation. "Alyssa. Why are you here?" Paul's shocked expression made Alyssa, presumably his affair partner, tilt her head in even more confusion. "Why? You invited me. You said you wanted to introduce me to your family because we're getting married." "Huh? When did I ever say that?" "When?" "Look, 2 weeks ago." As the woman showed the message exchange between her and Paul, Paul was startled. "I didn't send this." "Then who did?" Standing in front of the arguing pair, I stepped forward. "Nice to meet you, I'm Paul's wife. I was the one who invited you here today." "Sorry, Paul, but I sent the message without your knowledge." "Huh?" Both of them were left gaping at the same time. Yes. Ever since I received the Christmas invitation call from my mother-in-law, I had been waiting for the right moment to strike back at Paul. And 2 weeks ago, while Paul was taking his nightly bath, I secretly left the bedroom and took his smartphone. It was clear that Alyssa was his affair partner based on their frequent exchanges. I lied to get her here today to catch them in the act. The relatives began to murmur upon hearing our exchange. The faces of Paul's parents turned pale. I always found it strange. Why did Paul start a life of only coming home on weekends right after we got married? A weekend marriage means we hardly see each other even though we're married. What's the point? I thought, if he loved me, he wouldn't want to live like this. That's because I'm busy with work, I've told you many times. Paul still tried to resist, even now. I sighed deeply, exasperated. Work? Yes, I believed that story at first. But then I started smelling perfume on you when you came home at night and thought, could it be? So, I hired someone to investigate. Huh? Wait, what investigation? Paul began to tremble suddenly. I pulled out the detective agency's report on his infidelity from my bag. and thrust it towards Paul and the woman. I had commissioned the detective agency to investigate a little while ago. Evidence of his infidelity was quickly found, and I managed to obtain a wealth of proof like this. You started dating 5 years ago when Alyssa was just 15. You picked her up on the street and started dating. But of course, you couldn't marry a child like Alyssa. Moreover, Alyssa works in the nightlife industry now. It's unlikely her parents would approve. However, you felt pressured by your parents' wishes for you to get married soon. So, you caught a safe woman like me to marry, to stop your parents from nagging. Once things settled down, you planned to continue dating Alyssa under the guise of being too busy with work, and eventually leaving me to marry her. That's about the size of it. I revealed their deceit, piecing together information from the detective agency's report and the message exchanges between Paul and Alyssa. What are you saying? Paul doing such a thing? My mother-in-law tried to defend Paul, but faced with the presented evidence, she could no longer speak strongly and slumped her shoulders. Paul and the woman looked at each other, trembling. Then, Paul finally spoke up, saying, This is low. Using such tactics to disgrace us, what you're doing is dirty. At his words, I felt a rage so intense my veins were about to burst, and I yelled, Low? What are you talking about? The low one is you, who barely came home right after getting married, approaching me while having someone else, using me, and then blaming me while ignoring your faults. You were just waiting for me to get fed up and bring up divorce myself, weren't you? Well, too bad for you. Of course, we will divorce, but you will be paying compensation to your affair partner, too. I looked back and forth between Paul and the woman, glaring at them with the scariest face I've ever made. Why me too? I don't have any money. Please, forgive me. It was my fault. So, just not the compensation. I glared at the two of them again, begging for mercy, and yelled, Just get out. Paul and the woman, upon hearing my scream, finally screamed themselves and ran out of the house. Everyone, I am very sorry for the trouble. As I stepped back with dignity, sighs escaped from among the relatives. They were all dumbfounded by Paul's actions, speechless. Courtney. I don't know what to say. My mother-in-law, who had believed in Paul and criticized me, awkwardly looked down. Alongside my mother, who had pretended to be a housekeeper, I left my in-laws' house. Probably, I will never visit this house again. Thus, my 1-year troubled marriage to Paul came to an end. A few days later, I got Paul to sign the divorce papers and submitted them to the city hall. This officially made me single again. Though I ended up with a divorcee label, the marriage was short, and it hardly felt like a real marital life, so not much changed. Since Paul and I lived in a rental apartment, I managed to get him out without any issues. After that, Paul paid the demanded compensation. But since he had no savings, he had to ask relatives for a loan. Despite working at an elite company, he was broke because he had been lavishing expensive bags and clothes on his mistress. However, the relatives who witnessed the Christmas fiasco were, of course, not about to lend Paul any money. He had no choice but to take out a bank loan. The mistress did the same and paid her part of the compensation with a loan. Both of them started their journey into loan repayment hell, postponing their marriage, at least until they repay their debts. Both sets of parents have unanimously said they shouldn't get married. My in-laws must be tired of being dragged into trouble, and think it's high time they suffered through the repayment. Compared to the year of suffering I endured, earning money to repay is easy, I thought, feeling detached from the situation. Meanwhile, I returned to my job at the condominium management company and am now happily working. It's much better for my mental health than staying cooped up at home. If I ever decide to get married again, I silently vow to marry someone who is okay with both of us working.